Hello horror hounds. We continue our chronological look through the films of Dario Argento with the story of a serial rapist escalating now to murder loose in the streets of Rome and Florence. Also a female police detective on his trail, and when their personal game of cat and mouse begins, she suddenly succumbs to the very real medical condition that gives the film its title, which renders her overwhelmed and hallucinating in the face of powerful works of art. Art, violence, murder, beauty, surrealism, Italy. This is Dario Argento. This is the Stendhal Syndrome. In my previous video about trauma, I talked about how the American setting, the Minneapolis background, seemed to leach the colour out of the outlandish events in that movie, as if it were taking place in one of any of 100 American police procedural TV shows. I'm ecstatic to see Argento return to Italy for his next picture. It was up in the air as to whether or not the Stendhal Syndrome would be shot in America, starring perhaps Bridget Fonda or Daryl Hannah. Seeing the opening 20 minutes amongst a whirl of statues, centuries-old architecture, and then into the Uffizi Gallery rammed full of paintings that are so integral to the plot, it's hard to see how this story could have flown as high or as free in any other country than Italy. And this film does open in a whirl, as assured and powerful as anything else in Argento's canon. It's almost a shame to have to give any kind of synopsis up front, because the first-time viewer is thrown off balance from the start. It takes about 30 minutes for us to catch up with what we're being shown, putting us right in the headspace of Argento's character, having to play catch-up with her as she literally loses herself, her identity amongst the paintings of the Uffizi Gallery, and begins picking up the pieces of her personality throughout the rest of the film as we get to know her. I didn't like the Stendhal Syndrome the first time I saw it. The subject matter is incredibly challenging and it's not to my taste. However, with each successive viewing, I've come to like it more and more. I'd now champion it as perhaps the last truly great film Dario Argento has made. I'd happily put the opening 30 minutes against any of his other acknowledged masterpieces. In fact, having made peace with what the film actually is, rather than what I expected it to be or imagined it was, I personally put this film in its entirety up against anything else he's directed. Apart from some chunky mobile phones and early adopter CGI effects which date the film to the mid-90s, there's an energy, focus, unity of vision and intent present in this, a creative fire at the heart of this movie, wherein you could feasibly watch this next to Profondo Rosso or Tenebrae and think that they were made years and not decades apart. In the Stendhal Syndrome, Argento's career-long thesis about dangerous art finds its ultimate expression. Argento's always presented his films and art in general as something active and at times dangerous. He's always pulling back the curtain to show the clockwork, the artifice of cinema, like a play or an opera, but within the illusion you can hide perilous truths. Remember the spiky sculpture in the art gallery at the end of The Bird with the crystal plumage, his first film, that's used to cage the hero to facilitate his murder. In Tenebrae, Peter Neal's thriller novels are used as fuel and inspiration for a killer intent on turning fiction into fact and twisting it against his creator. And in that same piece, a chrome modern art sculpture actually becomes a killing implement when the supposedly deadly straight razor turns out to be a movie prop. There's the artifice of cinema coming into play again. Even towards the end of Trauma, the last film we talked about, remember when a forlorn David is drawn to an art gallery window, there a reproduction of Sir John Everett Millet's Ophelia floating in a river about to drown reminds him of his lost love Aura, again Argento. Notice how the picture of Ophelia is surrounded in the window display by depictions of decapitated heads, indicating the still active and enveloping presence of the headhunter killer in that film. One such picture is, I believe, Perseus with the head of Medusa, and Medusa by Caravaggio makes a brief but pronounced appearance in the opening minutes of the Stendhal Syndrome. Even before this, the opening credits play with a scrolling sidebar of all kind of arts from classical to modern flung together in strange juxtapositions that already alert you to the vibrancy and power of the image before those static pictures begin to run together at the magical rate of 24 a second, conjuring still frames into artificial life and motion. With the real-life medical condition, the Stendhal Syndrome of the title, which sees sufferers physically overwhelmed by works of art and great beauty, Dario Argento had found the perfect expression of everything he'd been trying to express about art in his career to date. As Alfredo, the film's villain, says, works of art have power over us. Great works of art have great power. With that in mind, it's important to let the Stendhal Syndrome be what it wants to be, not what you expected or hoped it was going to be. This is not your typical giallo movie. The identity of the killer and the rapist is not a mystery. This is not a whodunit, but a devastating psychological study of one of his pursuers and survivors. But let's begin with the villain before we move on to the real focus of the film. The rapist, Alfredo. Here there are shades of Thomas Harris's literary villains, as well as the real-life killings of Il Mostro, the monster of Naples, which inspired those Hannibal Lecter-like characters. Alfredo, played by Thomas Kretschmann, has no redeeming features whatsoever. He's a sadist, a serial rapist evolved into a serial killer, seemingly a monster in human form. I don't think his Aryan look is accidental. Kretschmann, already blonde, dyed his hair a lighter shade for the role, and before he came on board, Argento was going to cast Julian Sands in the role. Clearly Alfredo was intended to be white, blue-eyed and blonde, and I won't insult your intelligence by explaining why that might be. But this is not a film in the usual giallo mode. This film does not belong to the killer. It belongs to Dario Argento as Anna Manni. In previous videos we've touched upon criticism that Argento doesn't care about story or character but is instead obsessed with the aesthetic and set pieces. We've also wryly noted how he's criticised when he reins in his more outre visual instincts to focus on character and plot. It seems that if you're Dario Argento, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Yet very few seem to tip their hat to the fact the Stendhal Syndrome allows him both to exercise his most outlandish visual flourishes whilst presenting a rich and troubling character study of the hero of the film. Both elements go hand in hand, each serving the narrative. Dario Argento gives a blistering, mainly internalized powerhouse of a performance. The way the film is structured rewards repeat viewings, with appreciation growing with each watch. Given that the film's narrative phases so closely align with the developments, regressions, evolution of Anna's character, repeat viewings also help peel back the layers of and build appreciation for a truly great performance and character study. But let me be clear, this is a tough watch. It's brutal and uncompromising, but I don't think it descends into exploitation. The subject matter turned me off the first time I watched it. I'm not particularly drawn to rape and serial rape as a subject matter. Also, frankly, I wasn't prepared for the strange narrative structure. Letting the film shock and surprise you the first time is a valuable viewing experience, but I wouldn't recommend the film out of hand if the subject matter is likely to upset you. Further viewings, once you know what's going to come, allow you to get under the skin of the film. This isn't the film I thought it was after I'd first watched it. The instinct to not hide the killer and rapist, to not make discovering his identity a game, but to make the film about his pursuer, victim and survivor, does make me think that when push comes to shove, Dario Argento, much criticised for his depictions of violence against women, is more on their side than many would care to acknowledge. In my video for Trauma, we traced a through line, starting with the bird with the crystal plumage, of at first masculine uncertainty in the destabilising wake of the sexual revolution, feminism and the liberated woman. We saw these rudderless male heroes of the 70s films being replaced in the 80s with independent, inquisitive women with their own agency. Then on to trauma, which concerns itself partly with the institutions and societal levers that seek to restrict, confine and control these liberated women. And now on to the Stendhal Syndrome, a film about a female police officer trying to catch a serial rapist, becoming his victim, his survivor, and the psychological damage left in the wake of a character whose sole purpose is to terrorize, hurt, and impose his own will upon women. Rape is not about sex, it's about power and control, and Alfredo marks the very nadir of the reactionary forces aligned against women over the course of these films, over the course of history, who've sought freedom and equality. It would perhaps be too much of a stretch to call Dario Argento a feminist. I don't think the man himself has much time for labels of this or any other stripe. But taken in the round, there is a subtextual narrative that is developed across his films about women striving for equality. And think of all the other themes that we've been following throughout this series of reviews. Gender fluidity and confusion tied up with destroyed notions of traditionally masculine and feminine. In Dario Argento's film, women don't just wear the trousers, sometimes they wear the black gloves as well. All of this garnished with representations of homosexuality that we've used as a touchstone throughout his pictures. They find their locus here in Anna Mani and the phases of her strangely evolving and regressing personality. From a fairly standard female professional into a more androgynous and then masculine persona before a reinvention into the realms of film noir and the Hitchcockian ideal of the femme fatale. We watch Anna trying to come to terms with herself and her experience as if she's negotiating this battlefield of the sexes that has been raging for decades. When her boyfriend broaches the subject of sex following her rape, she reverses their roles, pinning him to the wall, literally dry humping him. She later tells her therapist that she wanted to fuck him the way a man fucks. In a later phase of the film, she seemingly finds happiness with a French art student called Marie, not only a nod to the real name of the writer Stendhal, but a very deliberate role reversal of masculine and feminine, as characters here mention of his name and assume that he is a girl. Even as Anna is surrounded by her male colleagues at the end of the film as they try to calm and restrain her in the language of the film that's preceded this moment's presented from her point of view as a gang rape. It's distressing, powerfully metaphorical, and a bleak final word on this supposed battle of the sexes that has been raging throughout all of his films. A battle that first was outwardly engaged with a degree of Howard Hawksian levity between Asia's mother, Daria Nicolodi, and David Hemmings in Profondo Rosso. Now from mother to daughter, seemingly ending with an expression that détente and understanding between the two sides can never be reached. I've gone from hating the Stendhal Syndrome to thinking it's an unsung masterpiece. It's certainly his last great movie. It's certainly also not to everyone's taste. It's uncompromising in its subject matter without being exploitative. But we move from the sublime to the ridiculous because next up is what's going to be an abrupt change of pace. For the first time, but not the last, Dario Argento enters the public domain.